They were symbols of power, but their own bodies became the price they paid for this symbol. Eunuchs were people who were castrated for the sake of serving the sovereign, for the sake of beauty, for the sake of control. Their fate began on cold operating tables, which no one called medical at the time. They were wooden stools in dirty courtyards, low rooms with stone floors, where blood flowed into clay vessels. Castration without anesthesia, without sterility, without hope of survival, all to turn a boy into a pure servant, capable of being in the most intimate spaces of power. In China, the eunuch system existed for centuries, beginning in the Zhou dynasty, but reached its peak during the Ming and Qing dynasties. There, castration was considered an official requirement for a man to serve in the palace. Inside the Forbidden City, eunuchs were the only men allowed into the chambers of the empress and concubines. This created a paradox. Deprived of the opportunity to have a family, they gained access to the very heart of power, but the path there was paved with pain and blood. The operation in China involved removing not only the testicles, but also the penis. This method was called Quan Shen, meaning complete body, although in essence, it meant its destruction. The procedure was performed by special castration masters. The boy or teenager's hands and feet were tied, and then his genitals were cut off with one swift movement of a knife. They tried to stop the bleeding with pressure and primitive bandages, and a bamboo tube was inserted into the wound to preserve the ability to urinate. Many died in the first few days from blood loss or infection. Those who survived were left permanently mutilated. Even more frightening was that castration was often carried out at the initiative of the parents. Poor families, unable to feed their children, resorted to this step, hoping that their sons, having become eunuchs, would find employment in the palace and provide their parents with protection and income. Historical sources describe cases where boys aged 7, 8, or 9 were subjected to surgery. They were then given a wooden box containing their severed organs, known as a certificate of castration. This had to be kept for life, because according to tradition, after the eunuch's death, the organ was returned to the body so that the person could enter the afterlife whole. In the Ottoman Empire, castration had a different context, but was no less cruel. Eunuchs there became guards of the Sultan's harems. Their operations were carried out on the outskirts of the empire, most often in Africa, where boys were kidnapped or bought at slave markets. Castration was performed using barbaric methods. Children were circumcised in unsanitary conditions, often with complete removal of the genitals. Only a small proportion survived. According to European travelers, only 2 or 3 out of 10 boys reached Constantinople, but those who survived ended up in the golden cage of the palace. From the outside, the life of a eunuch in the palace seemed privileged. Rich clothes, proximity to rulers, the opportunity to influence politics. But behind this facade lay loneliness and eternal dependence. A eunuch had no family, no right to offspring, and his existence was entirely tied to the fate of his master. One of the most famous was Wei Zhongxian in China, a eunuch who effectively ruled the empire in the early 17th century. In the Ottoman Empire, black eunuchs wielded enormous power at court, controlling access to the Sultan's harem. But these rare stories of power were the exception. For most eunuchs, life meant constant humiliation. Their bodies were not only mutilated, but also turned into symbols. Chinese texts mention that eunuchs had to speak in a high-pitched voice to demonstrate their otherness. Their appearance was also considered a sign of their status. They had no beards, and their facial features were altered. They were despised by society, but at the same time feared, because they could be close to the emperor. It is in this paradox, suffering as a ticket to a world of power and wealth, that the essence of the story of eunuchs lies. Their existence was only possible because the human body was seen not as a personal value, but as a tool for the system. This instrumental attitude toward the body manifested itself in the most extreme forms: mutilation for loyalty, deprivation for power, murder for control, operations without anesthesia, wounds that festered, death that was more likely than life, and the rare fate of those who survived to become cogs in the machinery of the empire. Castration for beauty and power is not a myth, but a reality recorded in the chronicles of China and the Ottoman Empire, where thousands of children were sacrificed to the idea of control. The mechanics of castration in China and the Ottoman Empire were equally cruel, but differed in detail. In China, there was a whole corps of so-called body cleaners, people who specialized in performing the operation. They did not have the status of doctors, but they were known and sought out when a family decided to send a boy to serve in the palace. Before the procedure, the child was given a little alcohol or poppy seed tea, but there was no pain relief in the modern sense. The body was tied to a bench, the arms and legs were fixed, and the mouth was stuffed with a rag so that the screams would not carry across the courtyard. With a knife or a blade made of hardened steel, everything was cut off in one movement. The scrotum and the penis, blood gushed out, and rags soaked in ash or salt were immediately applied to stop the bleeding. A bamboo or metal tube, a primitive catheter, was inserted into the urethra to prevent the boy from dying of urinary retention. If the tube fell out or the opening became blocked, death would follow within a few days from a ruptured bladder and blood poisoning. Of the 10 who underwent the operation, usually 3 or 4 survived. The rest died within a week. In the Ottoman Empire, castration was most often performed in the slave markets of Africa, in Sudan, Ethiopia, and the territories around Chad. Boys were bought from local tribes or kidnapped during military campaigns. The operation was performed by nomadic healers who did not even have a basic set of instruments. They used knives, red-hot blades, and sometimes even shards of glass. The wound was cauterized with hot iron or poured over with boiling oil. The mortality rate was enormous. European travelers in the 18th century wrote that out of 100 boys castrated in Sudan, no more than 20 survived to reach Istanbul. Those who survived became part of a special social class. In China, they were taken into the palace, where they became servants, clerks, and guards. Some rose very high. They managed finances, were responsible for the emperor's safety, and controlled the harem. During the Ming dynasty, eunuchs were a powerful force. Their numbers reached 70,000. It was a paradox. Men without offspring, deprived of families, controlled entire cities and armies. The situation was similar in the Ottoman Empire. Black eunuchs brought from Africa became guardians of the harem. Their leader, the Kızlar Ağası, had access to the Sultan and could influence his decisions. However, the path to this power was fraught with terrible pain. Those who survived the operation often suffered from complications for the rest of their lives. Continuous bladder infections, constant abdominal pain, and loss of hormonal function led to changes in voice, body, and psyche. Many developed psychosis caused by both physical changes and social isolation. They lived long lives, but in constant dependence on the court, because outside the palace system, eunuchs were considered cripples and a disgrace to their families. Official imperial texts concealed this suffering behind grandiose words. In China, it was said that eunuchs were purified and therefore worthy of serving the emperor. In the Ottoman Empire, their reliability was emphasized because a man deprived of his genitals was considered safe for the women of the harem. In reality, it was an institutionalized practice of cruelty. Castration not only physically crippled a person, but also turned him into a symbol of submission and absolute control. Mortality and suffering were justified by the system. In China, it was believed that only the strongest should serve the emperor, and if a boy did not survive, it meant that he was not worthy. In the Ottoman Empire, the death of slaves was seen as a natural part of trade. Documents show that the price of a boy who survived castration increased several times. He was considered proven and suitable for service. This cruel selection created a special class of people torn from normal life. Eunuchs could be rich and influential, but this wealth always came at a price: their own mutilated flesh and the thousands of lives lost on the way to the golden cages of the palaces. The daily life of eunuchs inside the palaces of China and the Ottoman Empire was a paradoxical mixture of luxury and humiliation. Outside, they could be seen in silk robes with rich belts, surrounded by servants, eating the finest food and living in stone chambers. But behind this outward appearance lay a reality in which body and soul were forever imprisoned. In China, eunuchs were divided into many categories and ranks. Some were cleaners, others were clerks, and still others served as personal assistants to the emperor and concubines. The highest positions gave power over finances and palace secrets. During the Ming Dynasty, eunuchs even controlled maritime expeditions. For example, the famous Admiral Zheng He, himself a eunuch, led a fleet that reached the shores of India and Africa, but most of their brothers remained in lower positions, cleaning rooms, keeping order, and serving food. Strict rules existed within the Forbidden City. Eunuchs had to wear clothes of a certain color, speak more quietly than any other official, and always bow their heads to the women of the harem. Their lives were based on obedience. The slightest mistake, a wrongly pronounced word, a delay in service, could cost them their lives. The chronicles mention the executions of eunuchs accused of conspiracy or simply of negligence. The executions were carried out in public to remind the others of the fragility of their position. In the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs, especially black eunuchs, lived in the Sultan's harems. They were not just guards. Their role was to completely isolate the women of the harem from the outside world. Eunuchs opened doors, accompanied concubines to the baths, and arranged meetings with the Sultan. They knew all the secrets of the palace. The senior eunuch of the harem, Kızlar Asa, wielded an enormous power. He decided which women would be presented to the Sultan and could influence the balance of political forces. But ordinary eunuchs remained nameless figures, trapped in a system where their every move was controlled. The physical consequences of castration were always present. Eunuchs suffered from chronic pain, infections, and difficulty urinating. Many had distended bellies, altered gaits, and high-pitched, shrill voices. These traits became their distinguishing marks. In Chinese texts, they were called Zhongxian, people with soft features, emphasizing their altered appearance. But behind this lay real suffering that accompanied them until the end of their lives. The psychological burden was no less heavy. Eunuchs lived without families, without offspring, without the right to love. In China, they were forbidden to marry, although they were sometimes allowed to adopt male students who helped them in their service. These students themselves became future eunuchs, and in this way, the system reproduced itself. In the Ottoman Empire, they also remained without families, their world limited to the walls of the palace. Sometimes, eunuchs were the victims of ridicule. Ordinary men considered them incomplete, but at the same time, society feared them. A eunuch close to the emperor or sultan could change the fate of an entire family overnight. This gave rise to a strange combination of contempt and fear, isolation and power. Sources have preserved the stories of the eunuchs themselves, rare but valuable. In 17th century China, several former eunuchs wrote memoirs describing life in the palace. They spoke of pain, fear, and how serving at the throne turned them into shadows that existed not for themselves, but for others. One of them wrote, "My body was destroyed so that I could enter the palace, but my soul was destroyed every day." In both China and the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs were living instruments of power. They did not belong to themselves. Their bodies became a pledge of trust. A man without genitals was considered safe, and therefore ideal for service, where absolute loyalty was required. But this loyalty was bought with blood and pain, and although a few rose to the heights of power, The majority remained at the bottom, locked in golden cages, their lives an endless series of submission and suffering. The rare cases when eunuchs rose to the heights of power became the most disturbing episodes in the history of empires. Their physical otherness made them paradoxical figures. They could not create a dynasty, had no offspring, and posed no threat to the succession to the throne. But it was precisely for this reason that they were allowed into the center of power. And in moments when rulers proved weak or dependent, eunuchs became the real masters of the state. In China, one of the most notorious cases is that of Wei Zhongxian, a eunuch who effectively ruled the Ming Empire in the early 17th century. He exploited the trust of the young and weak-willed Emperor Tianqi and created his own network of influence. Under his control were the judiciary, taxes, and even the army. Chronicles describe how officials were afraid to speak his name aloud, and those who opposed him were tortured and executed. Wei turned the system into a tool of personal power, eliminating hundreds of opponents. He was called the Ninth Emperor, although formally he was only a servant. But after the death of his patron, his power collapsed, and he himself died in agony. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs were repeatedly the object of hatred. Confucian scholars saw them as a threat to the traditional order. Texts compare eunuchs to rot in the bones of the empire. They were hated for their closeness to the emperor, for corruption, and for the secret power they gained through the palace. But it is precisely this hatred that once again emphasizes that eunuchs were an integral part of the political machine. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch, the Kızlar Ağası, played a similar role. This position gave control over the harem and access to the sultan. In the 17th and 18th centuries, some of them became so influential that they interfered in state affairs. Through the harem, they controlled the appointment of viziers, decided the fate of diplomatic missions, and controlled huge financial flows. Ottoman chroniclers wrote that the Kızlar Ağası could make a poor man a vizier, and a vizier a poor man. But the power of eunuchs always had a fragile foundation. It depended on the trust of the ruler and could collapse in an instant. If the sultan died or the emperor changed his favorite, the eunuchs would fall into disgrace. They could be exiled, chained, or executed. And then what was loyalty yesterday was declared conspiracy today. Sometimes eunuchs tried to defend their position with violence. History knows examples of conspiracies they organized to retain power. In China, groups of eunuchs organized secret networks within the palace, controlled concubines, and tried to control succession. In the Ottoman Empire, black eunuchs often participated in palace coups, helping some women in the harem to overthrow others. Their hands were involved in intrigues that determined the fate of sultans and entire generations. But behind this apparent power lay despair. A eunuch could never pass on his power to his children. His wealth and his position disappeared with his death, and so many of them sought to leave their mark on history by any means necessary, through the construction of palaces, bloody purges, and political games. Society viewed them with hatred and fear. For ordinary people, eunuchs were symbols of a distorted nature, men without courage, yet wielding power greater than that of military leaders. In Chinese folklore, eunuchs were often portrayed as demons, cunning, and cruel. In the Ottoman Empire, they were rumored to be keepers of the sultan's secret sins. Thus, a tragic duality emerged, crippled and enslaved, victims of a horrific operation, yet at the same time, rulers whose decisions determined the fate of thousands. Their power was born of pain, and this power inevitably ended in pain, death, disgrace, and oblivion. The decline of the institution of eunuchs was slow, and this too became part of their tragedy. In China, where they had existed for over 2,000 years, the last large corps of eunuchs still served at the end of the 19th century at the court of the Qing dynasty. Their numbers were estimated in the thousands, although their real power had already been undermined by external threats and internal crises. When the empire collapsed at the beginning of the 20th century, the system of palace eunuchs disappeared with it. Historians note that some of them were still living in the 1920s in the ruined Forbidden City, serving the museum and tourists, and telling journalists about how they had been castrated as children. Their lives became living reminders of a monstrous practice that until recently was considered normal. In the Ottoman Empire, the situation changed somewhat earlier. In the 19th century, under pressure from European reforms and modernization, the institution of black eunuchs gradually lost its significance. But until the end of the century, the position of Kızlar Ağası still existed in the Sultan's harem. It was only after the fall of the empire and the formation of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s that eunuchs disappeared completely. According to contemporary accounts, the last old eunuchs could still be found in Istanbul in the 1930s, when they served as guardians of the old palace chambers. The medical and social aspects of their existence amazed even their contemporaries. European travelers of the 18th, 19th centuries described eunuchs as living ghosts, noting their altered bodies, high voices, lack of beards, strange figures with narrow shoulders and distended bellies. Many suffered from chronic diseases, constant infections, and incontinence. Their lives could last for decades, but were almost always accompanied by physical torment. The symbolic meaning of eunuchs has endured for a long time. In China, their image has become entrenched as a reminder of corruption and court intrigues. Even in the 20th century, the word eunuch could be used to insult an official, implying his baseness and dependence. In the Ottoman tradition, the memory of black eunuchs became intertwined with the image of the harem. They remained in history as keepers of the Sultan's secrets and as figures feared by both women and men. But behind these symbols, there were always real lives. Hundreds of thousands of children, mostly boys from poor families or slaves, were castrated and died, either immediately or years later in isolation and disease. Only a few achieved power and wealth, and these stories should not obscure the fact that the foundation of this institution was built on pain and deprivation of human dignity. The decline of eunuchs coincided with the beginning of a new era, when the human body gradually ceased to be seen as an instrument of absolute control. But the memory of them remains a reminder of how state systems are capable of using and maiming their own subjects for the sake of stability and power. The history of castration in the name of beauty and control is not an episode, but an entire chapter in world history. It lasted for millennia, crossed continents, and changed the fate of empires. And although such practices are now a thing of the past, the very logic of sacrificing the personal to the system remains frighteningly familiar. Eunuchs have disappeared, but their story continues to serve as a warning. Power taken to its extreme always demands blood, pain, and human sacrifice.